We share 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, but after reviewing today's obituaries, I think the chimps got the better deal. Welcome to the bleeding edge of natural selection, where supreme arrogance violently collides with the laws of physics. For legal reasons, treat these 10 fatal brain farts as a strict do-not-do list, not a weekend itinerary. Let's look at some spectacular exits. 1. Deep in the heart of suburban Texas, a sweltering Saturday afternoon became the testing ground for an engineering disaster of truly spectacular proportions. Brought to you by a man who looked at centuries of military artillery development and thought, I can definitely build that cheaper at a hardware store. Our first architect of his own demise was a guy whose unwavering confidence in his own mechanical genius was matched only by his absolute refusal to understand basic high school physics. His grand vision was to construct a homemade shoulder-mounted tube launcher capable of launching a massive 15-pound bowling ball across a sprawling empty field. This project required ignoring every single natural instinct for self-preservation he possessed. Now, let's quickly review the fundamental mechanics of a basic projectile launcher. A controlled explosion happens in a chamber, and rapidly expanding gases push a projectile down a rigidly strong tube. This means the tube absolutely must be stronger than the pressure trying to rip it apart. Professional cannons are forged from thick, heavy-duty ordnance steel to handle this immense stress. Our Lone Star visionary, however, decided to hit the plumbing aisle instead, settling on a 6-foot length of standard-issue white PVC pipe, a material explicitly designed to gently transport household wastewater, not to contain the violent fury of a highly pressurized chemical reaction. He spent weeks meticulously gluing the plastic joints together, completely oblivious to the fact that sticking a dense, heavy bowling ball into a snug plastic cylinder effectively creates a massive, airtight plug, transforming his oversized potato gun into a devastatingly efficient, unregulated pressure vessel. On the day of the fateful launch, he invited a few buddies over to witness history, propped his plastic doom tube onto a pair of sawhorses, carefully slid the custom-fitted bowling ball down the barrel, and loaded a frankly unhinged amount of flammable propellant into the ignition chamber. He didn't just want it to fire, he wanted to break the sound barrier. He entirely failed to realize that the gargantuan inertia of a 15-pound spherical weight meant the ball was going to stubbornly resist moving, leaving those rapidly expanding ignition gases nowhere to go but aggressively outward. With the dramatic flair of a medieval siege commander, he stood right next to his creation, leaned in close, and enthusiastically hit the electronic ignition switch, expecting a glorious, thunderous launch. The bowling ball, adhering strictly to the laws of inertia, barely budged a single inch forward. The horrific spike in back pressure, however, instantly overwhelmed the structural integrity of the cheap plumbing supplies. The entire pressure chamber catastrophically ruptured with the concussive force of a military-grade artillery shell. The blast instantly vaporized the cannon, transforming the seemingly harmless white plastic pipe into a merciless, omnidirectional cloud of high-speed plastic confetti that abruptly and permanently deactivated our rogue engineer before the smoke even had a chance to clear the yard. In a brilliantly dark twist of physical irony, when paramedics finally arrived to survey the catastrophic wreckage, they discovered the bowling ball sitting quietly in the grass, completely unscathed. It had successfully won its staring contest with a highly combustible mixture and a spectacularly terrible idea. 2. The hollow concrete cinder block. A fantastic invention for building cheap garden walls, but a spectacularly terrible substitute for professional automotive safety equipment. Our next protagonist, however, was the poster child for lethal frugality, firmly believing that spending money on certified jack stands was a public admission of cowardice. He looked at the safety warnings in the manual of his massive 3-ton pickup truck and interpreted them as mere suggestions for people with softer hands. The setting for this spectacular triumph of lethal frugality was his front lawn on a slightly drizzly Tuesday. This location wasn't a flat concrete driveway, but an uneven, rain-softened patch of suburban topsoil. He needed to crawl underneath the immense steel undercarriage to fix a transmission. This universally requires the truck to be securely supported by heavy-duty, professionally welded steel jack stands. However, our thrifty mechanic looked at the $30 price tag of certified stands at the auto parts store and scoffed. He decided instead to raid his wife's vegetable garden for a cheaper solution. He dragged over 2 hollow, weathered cinder blocks, oblivious to the reality that standard masonry blocks are engineered to support evenly distributed static weight as part of a wall. They are absolutely not designed to withstand the concentrated point load of a 6,000-pound metal leviathan. To make matters worse, he wasn't placing these brittle blocks onto a solid foundation. He was pressing them directly into the damp mud. Using a cheap hydraulic jack, he pumped the heavy chassis into the air, slid the garden blocks under the frame rails, and completely ignored the deeply unsettling crunching sounds emanating from the concrete. He didn't pause to register the terrifying fact that the left block was already visibly sinking into the rain-soaked earth at a severely crooked angle, creating a catastrophically asymmetrical distribution of pressure. Filled with the toxic confidence of a man who just successfully saved $30, he proudly slid his creeper board directly into the claustrophobic drop zone beneath the oil pan. He wedged his chest firmly between the earth and the heavy steel drivetrain. He barely had time to unscrew a single bolt before the uncompromising laws of physics violently intervened. The uneven pressure from the truck's frame proved too much for the sinking concrete. The cinder blocks didn't just crack. They catastrophically shattered into 1,000 useless fragments of dust. With absolutely nothing left to hold back gravity, the entire 3-ton mass of the pickup plummeted straight down with terrifying speed. The impact was a brutal, instantaneous lesson in the false economy of improvised safety gear, instantly pancaking his workspace under the massive weight of the drivetrain and abruptly ending his lifelong boycott of professional tools. The only sound left was the rain tapping against the grounded truck, hiding a perfectly flattened reminder that gravity simply does not care about your budget. 3. What happens when you mix a blood alcohol level that could sterilize surgical equipment with an ego the size of a freight train? You get our next candidate, the excessively loud alpha of every bar crawl who feels an uncontrollable burning need to prove his dominance through acts of wildly unnecessary physical peril. Our next candidate decided that simply downing cheap tequila shots wasn't extreme enough to build his personal brand as the ultimate tough guy. This was a man whose blood alcohol content was directly engaged in a hostile takeover of his common sense, leaving him with the false, invincible swagger of an action movie star who somehow forgot the real world doesn't deploy convenient CGI safety nets. After enthusiastically convincing his drunk entourage that he was secretly an underground urban adrenaline junkie, he marched them all out to the local commuter rail station with a brilliantly unhinged plan to surf the roof of the 11:30 p.m. outbound express train. The fundamental problem with train surfing, aside from the obvious illegality and staggering voltage of overhead power lines, is that commuter trains are sleek, aerodynamic metal tubes designed specifically to slip through the air with minimal friction. They completely lack handles, grip tape, or any sort of convenient structural features designed to accommodate an intoxicated human desperately trying to maintain his footing at highway speeds. Ignoring the desperately shouted warnings from the one friend still sober enough to understand basic physics, our self-appointed king of the rails scrambled up the side of the stationary carriage. He hauled himself onto the smooth, curved metal roof just as the doors chimed and the massive locomotive began to violently lurch forward out of the station. For about 45 glorious, uninterrupted seconds, he actually managed to pull it off. He staggered into a wide-legged, highly unbalanced surfer's stance as the train rapidly accelerated into the dark night, prompting him to wildly pump his fists in the air and scream victorious obscenities into the rushing wind. He genuinely believed he had conquered the urban jungle. However, while he was busy soaking in the majestic feeling of being a true rebel, he had completely neglected to factor in the incredibly rigid, unapologetic reality of municipal civil engineering. Specifically, he forgot the fact that train tracks are heavily peppered with low-hanging infrastructure designed strictly for the height of the train itself, with absolutely zero margin of error allocated for unexpected roof-dwelling cargo. He was so busy looking down to taunt the blurry scenery passing by that he completely failed to spot the massive reinforced concrete pedestrian overpass rapidly materializing out of the darkness straight ahead. It was essentially a solid, immovable brick wall suspended a mere 2 feet above the top of the speeding carriage. He didn't even have a fraction of a second to register his impending architectural doom before the train violently shot underneath the bridge at 60 miles per hour. The concrete structure treated his upright surfing body exactly like a pesky, oversized hood ornament, encountering an aggressive low-hanging branch. The impact was an instantaneous, brutal lesson in kinetic energy transfer, abruptly and permanently terminating his brief but spectacular career as a transit daredevil. The train smoothly continued its scheduled route completely unbothered, leaving a very confused cleaning crew at the final terminal to figure out why the aerodynamic dome of carriage number 4 suddenly required a heavy-duty power washing. 4. The humble clothesline. 2 posts, a length of rope, and 0 engineering degrees required. Unless, of course, you hand the project to an obsessively over-engineering suburban dad who treats every household chore like a military fortification contract. The mastermind behind this specific suburban disaster was a man who firmly believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth overdoing to the point of absolute absurdity. His wife had simply asked him to put up a new clothesline in the yard so she could hang dry a few heavy winter quilts. It's a charmingly simple task that functionally requires nothing more than a few yards of basic cotton rope strung between 2 wooden posts. However, our aggressively masculine protagonist looked at the delicate concept of a traditional clothesline and scoffed. He decided instead to raid his chaotic garage for a heavy-duty spool of braided industrial-grade steel winch cable, the exact kind of heavy rigging utilized by commercial tow trucks to drag submerged vehicles out of muddy ravines. He firmly anchored one end of this massive metallic python to the trunk of a towering oak tree, walked it across the lawn, and attached the other end to a remarkably powerful ratcheting hand winch bolted securely to a maple tree, transforming his quiet yard into a highly dangerous industrial tensioning zone. As he enthusiastically began cranking the heavy mechanical lever, he completely ignored the fundamental reality that every piece of manufactured metal has a critical yield point. Driven by a bizarre, pathological need for the cable to be perfectly straight, he kept hauling back on the heavy ratcheting arm. He completely dismissed the terrifying, high-pitched metallic groaning sounds emanating from the strained alloy, ignoring the alarming fact that the 2 massive trees were actually beginning to physically bow inward. The thick steel cable was stretched so agonizingly tight that it was literally humming a crisp, high C note in the breeze, vibrating with enough stored potential energy to launch a small aircraft. But our backyard visionary wiped his brow and decided it needed exactly one more good click to be truly perfect. He forcefully threw his entire body weight backward to force the heavy steel gear into the next notch, pushing the industrial material far past its breaking point. The overstressed alloy finally gave up the ghost with an apocalyptic, ear-splitting sonic crack. In a fraction of a millisecond, all of that colossal potential energy was violently unleashed. The snapped heavy steel cable transformed into a supersonic, utterly unstoppable metallic razor whip, lashing backward through the air. Because our wildly ambitious engineer was standing directly in the unforgiving path of the backlash, the cable whipped around precisely at neck height with devastating, uncompromising precision, resulting in a sudden, highly traumatic and permanent disconnection from his shoulders. In the tragically ironic aftermath, the snapped ends of the cable dangled harmlessly from the trees, leaving behind a stark, brutal lesson that drying wet laundry absolutely does not require commercial bridge building materials. 5. In the hyper-connected era of social media, the unquenchable thirst for internet clout has driven fully functioning adults to abandon all tethers to reality. Our next candidate was a self-proclaimed local tough guy, whose fragile ego was writing massive checks his skeletal structure was fundamentally incapable of honoring. He desperately wanted to build an online brand around his supposedly superhuman pain tolerance, convincing his gullible followers he had magically unlocked the secret to becoming completely impervious to blunt force trauma. To prove his absolute invincibility in what he promised would be the ultimate viral video, he bypassed common sense and acquired a deeply outdated, severely expired police riot vest from a sketchy military surplus store. Now, the Darwin Awards require you to orchestrate your own demise without outside help. To ensure this feat qualified as a solo endeavor, he transformed his suburban backyard into a highly questionable physics laboratory by constructing a terrifyingly robust, do-it-yourself pendulum of death suspended from a heavy steel frame. He meticulously tied a solid iron, 12-pound demolition sledgehammer to a thick nautical rope, hoisted it back to an aggressive 90-degree angle, and secured it to a makeshift trigger mechanism with a quick-release slipknot, essentially building a miniature siege engine. The catastrophic flaw in his logic was a profound misunderstanding of how protective armor functions. A standard police riot vest is specifically engineered to distribute the broad, sweeping impact of a wooden baton swung by a tired human arm. It is unequivocally not designed to absorb the pinpoint, devastatingly focused kinetic energy of a 12-pound chunk of solid iron accelerating through a perfect pendulum arc, courtesy of gravity. Dressed in his dusty second-hand armor, he hit record on his camera, delivered an unhinged motivational monologue about how pain is merely an illusion, and stepped directly into the target zone right at the lowest point of the pendulum's vicious trajectory. With a theatrical scream, he dramatically yanked the quick-release cord, surrendering his fate to the uncompromising laws of classical mechanics as the sledgehammer plummeted downward with the wrath of Sir Isaac Newton himself. The heavy iron head struck the exact dead center of his chest with a deafening crack, instantly bypassing the pitiful foam padding as if it were warm butter. The heavily concentrated transfer of kinetic energy catastrophically overwhelmed his skeletal structure, forcefully compromising his physical architecture, and delivered an unsurvivable shock directly to his internal organs, abruptly canceling his subscription to the mortal plane. The camera obediently kept rolling in the eerily quiet aftermath, capturing the ironic reality that his quest for an immortal viral flex only succeeded in producing a high-definition documentary of his own wildly preventable demise. 6. There is a dangerously specific brand of bleeding heart animal lover who operates under the misguided delusion that the harsh realities of the wild animal kingdom can be easily solved with a warm hug. Our final candidate's overwhelming desire to be a Disney-style hero resulted in one of the most spectacularly ironic misdirections in the history of the Darwin Awards. The scene of this chaotic tragedy was the narrow, gravel-strewn shoulder of a fiercely busy interstate highway, just as the sun was setting. This created a highly hazardous environment where commercial semi-trucks were blasting by at a terrifying 75 miles per hour. Our aggressively compassionate protagonist was driving home when his headlights illuminated a small, furry, motionless lump lying on the edge of the asphalt. His moral compass immediately commanded him to slam on his brakes, pull over into the danger zone, and attempt a heroic roadside rescue. He leaped out of his car and marched through the deafening roar of the traffic to investigate, discovering a rather large, entirely unresponsive North American opossum sprawled on the gravel, its eyes glassy and its mouth open. A person with even a rudimentary understanding of woodland biology would instantly recognize this scenario. The opossum is globally famous for possessing exactly one primary evolutionary defense mechanism against predators. It drops to the ground and performs an incredibly convincing physical impression of an expired piece of wildlife. However, our wildly uneducated wildlife paramedic looked at this perfectly healthy, highly stressed marsupial and completely misdiagnosed its biological defense tactic as a sudden cardiac arrest that desperately required human medical intervention. Kneeling on the sharp gravel just inches away from the roaring white line of the highway, he made the unfathomably gross, mind-boggling decision to administer emergency mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to a wild, flea-ridden creature. He leaned his face directly down toward the animal, pinched its furry nose, and attempted to seal his lips over its snout. This was an aggressive action that immediately forced the panicked opossum to violently abandon its theatrical performance. The terrified animal, suddenly waking up to find a giant, bizarrely affectionate ape trying to eat its face, reacted with pure survival instinct. It instantly snapped its jaws shut and aggressively clamped its bite firmly onto our hero's facial features. The agonizing, blinding shock of having a screaming, thrashing wild marsupial suddenly stapled to his face triggered an immediate, overwhelming panic response. This caused him to completely lose all situational awareness and forget the perilous geographic reality of his exact location. Uttering a muffled shriek of absolute terror, he forcefully yanked his body backward to escape the furious opossum, taking one massive, completely blind, stumbling step straight backward off the gravel shoulder and directly into the active right lane of the roaring interstate. He absolutely never even saw the massive cargo truck rapidly barreling out of the twilight. The vehicle was moving so fast that the driver didn't even have a fraction of a second to hit the brakes before instantly and permanently concluding the man's brief, disastrous career as an amateur roadside veterinarian. 7. Some people sleepwalk into the kitchen for a midnight snack. Our next genius sleepwalked into what was functionally a crematorium and tucked himself in for a nap. This chronically exhausted midnight shift worker at a German steel foundry possessed a highly dangerous combination of traits: a flagrant disregard for occupational safety manuals, an overwhelming desire to nap on the company dime, and an absolutely delusional level of trust in his own biological circadian rhythm. This gentleman possessed a highly dangerous combination of traits: a flagrant disregard for occupational safety manuals, an overwhelming desire to nap on the company dime, and an absolutely delusional level of trust in his own biological circadian rhythm. He desperately needed a spot that was dark, quiet, and far away from the prying eyes of shift supervisors. After wandering around the glowing facility, he struck absolute gold when he stumbled upon a colossal, multi-ton industrial ladle. This gargantuan metal bucket was normally used to transport thousands of gallons of bubbling, incandescent, molten slag. It was temporarily empty, resting in a maintenance bay, and to his sleep-deprived brain, the curved interior looked like the perfect steel hammock for a quick mid-shift snooze. Before climbing inside, he casually strolled right past a brightly illuminated, aggressively flashing electronic warning sign that clearly spelled out in stark German efficiency that this specific piece of equipment was scheduled for an automated thermal cleaning cycle. He knew the factory's central computer system was hardwired to swing a massive array of industrial gas burners over the ladle and ignite them to blast away leftover slag at precisely 4 a.m. However, he confidently reasoned that his legendary internal alarm clock would naturally wake him up at 3:55 a.m., giving him a luxurious 5-minute buffer to stretch, yawn, and casually climb out before the inferno began. Relying on an internal biological clock to save you from a computerized blast furnace is a profound misunderstanding of which force is actually in charge of the situation. He shimmied down into the cold, dark belly of the metal beast, curled up comfortably at the bottom, and almost immediately slipped into a remarkably deep, peaceful state of rapid eye movement sleep. As the minutes ticked closer to the hour, the factory around him continued its relentless, automated ballet, oblivious to the unauthorized organic material currently catching some Z's in Sector 4. At 3:55 a.m., his internal clock, tragically unbothered by the impending threat of immolation, completely failed to ring. Exactly 5 minutes later, at 4:09 a.m. on the dot, the uncompromising precision of German industrial engineering kicked in flawlessly. The massive robotic arm swung the heavy thermal burners directly over the opening of the ladle and instantly unleashed a blinding, roaring torrent of highly pressurized, superheated flames straight down into the bowl. The automated cleaning cycle was designed to aggressively incinerate hardened metallic impurities at temperatures rivaling the surface of the sun. Our sleepy protagonist's transition from a deep slumber to becoming a permanent, carbonized part of the foundry's infrastructure was practically instantaneous, entirely bypassing any opportunity for a rude awakening. When the morning crew finally arrived to inspect the freshly sanitized equipment, they were highly confused to find the ladle perfectly clean of slag, but containing a very strange, totally unexplainable pile of ash. 8. In the adrenaline-fueled subculture of extreme weather enthusiasts, there are those who observe Mother Nature from a safe distance, and those who take severe weather warnings as a direct challenge to their manhood. This brings us to a spectacularly foolish resident of Kansas, who spent years scoffing at the frantic pleas of meteorologists begging people to take shelter in their basements during tornado season. He genuinely believed hiding underground was an embarrassing display of weakness. Instead, he harbored a deeply unhinged fantasy of becoming the first human to physically stand his ground and ride the wind of a twister. Rather than investing in a scientifically designed storm-chasing vehicle, he trusted his life to a completely deranged do-it-yourself engineering project. He meticulously constructed what he proudly called his ultimate invincibility suit, an absurd contraption fashioned entirely out of 4 layers of discarded memory foam mattresses. He wrapped these bulky bedding materials tightly around his body, securing them with dozens of cargo straps and an industrial supply of silver duct tape, topping off the ridiculous ensemble with a scratched motorcycle helmet. When the deafening wail of the county tornado sirens finally echoed across the plains, signaling the imminent arrival of a massive atmospheric blender, he didn't run for the cellar. He enthusiastically waddled out into the center of his front yard like a heavily upholstered gladiator. Using a thick climbing rope, he lashed himself securely to the massive trunk of a century-old oak tree, determined to weather the apocalyptic storm through sheer willpower and discount betting. As the gargantuan vortex of absolute destruction roared onto his property, tearing the roof off his house and flattening his barn, our padded protagonist actually experienced a few fleeting seconds of glorious triumph. The climbing rope held fast, the oak tree refused to budge, and miraculously, his ridiculous mattress armor functioned exactly as he hoped. It successfully absorbed the painful, high-speed impacts of flying gravel and tree branches, leaving him laughing maniacally into the howling wind. However, his wildly arrogant calculations had focused entirely on surviving the sheer wind speed, completely neglecting to factor in the terrifying kinetic energy of the heavy payload the tornado had picked up along its path. Just as he threw his padded arms open in a gesture of absolute defiance, the rapidly rotating winds violently regurgitated a massive section of steel roof truss, ripped clean from his own house just moments earlier, launching it horizontally out of the chaotic debris cloud like a rogue freight train. The massive steel beam, traveling through the air at well over 100 miles per hour, completely bypassed his foam padding and delivered a catastrophic, instantly terminal transfer of kinetic energy to his midsection. The catastrophic irony was not lost on the universe. His own roof, the very structure he had arrogantly refused to hide beneath, had circled back with a vengeance to permanently settle the argument. He proved definitively that while duct tape and memory foam might successfully stop a flying twig, they offer absolutely zero tactical defense against your own house deciding to fight back. 9. Meet the kind of man who binge-watches home renovation shows and genuinely believes that qualifies him as a licensed structural engineer. Our next wildly overconfident protagonist firmly believed his aesthetic vision vastly outranked the fundamental principles of physics, and that any wall standing in the way of his dream open-concept living space was simply asking to be demolished. This rogue do-it-yourself decorator recently purchased a cramped condo on the second floor of a sturdy, concrete apartment building. He immediately developed a profound hatred for a massive, heavily reinforced concrete pillar situated squarely in the dead center of his new living room. To his Pinterest-addled mind, this thick column was a visual monstrosity that ruined the feng shui of the space and interrupted the natural light. He completely ignored the terrifying reality that massive concrete pillars are almost never placed in the middle of a multi-story building for purely decorative purposes. He made the immediate executive decision that the pillar had to go, refusing to consult a licensed engineer because he firmly believed tearing down walls was just a matter of applying enough brute force. Armed with nothing more than a heavy-duty 12-pound sledgehammer, cheap safety glasses, and a complete absence of architectural literacy, he began to aggressively dismantle the core skeletal structure of the apartment building. For over an hour, he relentlessly swung that heavy iron hammer into the dense concrete, completely ignoring the deeply alarming warnings the building itself was actively giving him. As he began to expose and aggressively saw through the thick steel rebar hidden within the concrete core, the ceiling above him began to emit a terrifying cacophony of deep, agonizing groans and snapping sounds. A continuous cascade of white plaster dust rained down on his shoulders, and severe spiderweb cracks started sprinting across the drywall right above his head like lightning bolts. He cheerfully dismissed all of these apocalyptic structural red flags as simply the old building settling into its fabulous new open floor plan. Intoxicated by his grand vision of an unobstructed entertainment space, he put every ounce of his remaining strength into one final, heroic swing of the sledgehammer. He successfully shattered the last remaining chunk of the load-bearing concrete, entirely severing the critical structural connection between his floor and the ceiling. He achieved his ultimate dream of opening up the space, but at the immediately fatal cost of removing the only thing preventing gravity from asserting its dominance. The unforgiving consequence of his aesthetic triumph was instantaneous. Without the pillar to support the immense multi-ton weight of the concrete slab above him, the ceiling didn't just slowly sag, it catastrophically and violently imploded. In a fraction of a second, the upstairs neighbor's entire living room, complete with a massive sectional sofa, a fully stocked oak bookshelf, and a large television, instantly relocated directly downward into his newly expanded living space. Our wildly ambitious decorator was immediately and permanently compacted underneath the catastrophic avalanche of high-density concrete and mid-century modern furniture, serving as a very dark, permanent reminder that before you violently alter the feng shui of a room, you should make sure you aren't dismantling the roof over your head. 10. Have you ever stared at a massively pressurized rubber tire and thought, you know what this volatile situation really needs? Open flames? Probably not, because you possess a basic survival instinct, unlike our next automotive visionary. He genuinely believed professional repair shops were just elaborate scams, treating bright yellow warning labels as cowardly suggestions meant for lesser men. The setting for this spectacular triumph of hubris over basic thermodynamics was a cluttered driveway on a lazy Sunday afternoon, where our protagonist was staring down a significantly bent steel rim on his massive pickup truck. The standard, globally accepted procedure for fixing a bent rim involves completely deflating the tire, removing the rubber, and only then applying intense heat to the steel. But taking the tire off felt like an insulting waste of 20 minutes to a guy who valued sheer laziness over basic survival. He made the executive decision to leave the commercial-grade tire fully mounted and pumped up to a rock-solid 80 pounds per square inch. Dragging his heavy-duty blowtorch out of the garage, he cranked the gas until he had a roaring blue flame hot enough to melt engine blocks. He casually crouched next to the wheel well and pressed that 2,000-degree column of fire directly against the steel rim, mere millimeters from the pressurized rubber. If you paid attention in high school chemistry, you might recall Charles's law. When you heat a confined gas, it aggressively expands. By superheating the rim, our backyard mechanic was boiling the trapped air inside, drastically increasing the internal pressure while actively melting the rubber, holding all that explosive energy back. He completely ignored the horrific stench of vulcanized rubber, violently cooking, treating the alarming sizzling sounds like a hearty steak searing on a grill rather than the death rattle of an impending apocalypse. He kept the torch locked in place until the steel glowed cherry red, entirely oblivious to the weakened sidewall bubbling outward like a grotesque tumor right next to his face. The inevitable failure of the rubber happened instantly, resulting in a cataclysmic structural rupture that transformed the wheel into a devastating, unguided kinetic projectile. The blast launched the heavy steel rim outward with the terrifying kinetic force of a launched industrial payload, permanently erasing our frugal mechanic from the census registry. His desperate attempt to save a $15 tire demounting fee cost him his life, leaving behind a perfectly straight rim he'd never get to appreciate. We need to crown an absolute champion of stupidity. Who is the undisputed MVP of this Darwin Award draft class? Give me your most toxic, sarcastic eulogy for them in the comments below. If you appreciate the fact that you currently have a pulse, hit subscribe and aggressively click like to feed the machine. Go drink some water and avoid heavy machinery today.